Hey there, it's Ina from Taproot Tarot, and I wanted to do a little video to let you know my recommendations for decks to get to start learning Tarot de Marseille reading styles, or pips in general. I tried to make this about decks that come with very useful guidebooks or little white books, but I couldn't resist what I have come to determine, what is in my opinion, the most useful book for someone just beginning with learning the Tarot de Marseille. Now, I'm a fan of a lot of different authors out there. I have a bunch of Vincent Peticci's books. I have Tom Benjamin's books. Yoav Bendov's book is excellent. Hodorowski's book has some good stuff in it, and some questionable stuff as well. And of course, Anamaria Marsucci's book, which I discuss a lot because that's the one that I learned from. But Untold Tarot is going to be the winner in that department. And I'll let you know why I think that later, but let's talk about decks first. These are some of the most useful decks that I think you can begin with. Lee Burston's Universal Tarot de Marseille has been, in the past, Los Scarabæo's default TDM deck, even though it is based on the Burdell, which is a TDM derivative and kind of a bridge between the TDM pattern and the Swiss style, but can absolutely be read like a Tarot de Marseille, and is kind of prettier than what some consider to be maybe more simplistic art in the standard TDM pattern. This also has some nice color coordination with the suits and some beautiful, colorful backgrounds to it. Anamaria Marsucci's decks are now the default Lo Scarabeo TDM design, which are based on the Convert deck. I don't have the one that sticks to the colors of the Convert quite yet, but I do have the vintage version of it, and it comes with the guidebook written by Anamaria Marsucci, which is a shortened version of her book and is super useful. Another one of my very first TDM decks was the Tarot de Maria Celia, and it's not in print anymore, but is still gettable, and I'll let you know in a minute why I think it's still worth mentioning, because it's got a really great guidebook to it. But let's start with Lee Burston. If you are particular about sticking with non-esoteric or pre-esoteric associations for the cards, I would go with Lee Burston for sure. He probably does the best job of that of anyone I'm going to talk about today. And one way that I determine if a guidebook incorporates esoteric or English tradition associations is to check a couple of specific cards. The first one being the Magician or Juggler. And if it says anything about having all the tools you need available to you, that kind of thing, that's an esoteric interpretation of this card. Here, Lee Burston says tricking or taking advantage of others, or if you are being, or you are the one being tricked. Thriving outside society's norms, beating the system, physical or mental dexterity, and travel. That's very in line with a historical interpretation of this card that's not kind of weighed down by esoteric baggage. The other one that's great to check is the Hanged one, Le Pendu, sorry, I'm getting my pronouns incorrect here. So key 12, the Hanged Man. If it says something about gaining a new perspective or needing to pause, things like that, those are esoteric interpretations. Here, he sticks to a solid historical interpretation: betrayal, being discovered doing something unethical, being accused of something rightly or wrongly, being made an example of, being embarrassed, voluntarily submitting to public humiliation. And honestly, you know, if you're using tarot for spiritual development or personal development, maybe the esoteric translations or interpretations are going to be more useful. For everyday life, I kind of find the historical interpretations to be much more practical. Now, a lot of people come to reading the TDM without wanting to learn a whole new set of interpretations for the majors, but they want to learn about reading pips. And this is another area where Lee Burston really excels. In my opinion, the numbers and court rankings are much more important than the suits. And so I prefer a guidebook or little white book which organizes the pips by number rather than by suit. Now, Burston really doesn't give individual meanings for the cards here. He gives more of an instruction on how to approach the pips and courts. So he does give some really good definitions for the suits, and then he follows more or less Pythagorean interpretations for the numbers, and some pretty historically accurate and I think largely accepted meanings for the court rankings. But then he goes on just to give some advice on blending those meanings in order to interpret the cards. Now, this little white book only has 14 pages in English, So there's not a lot of information here. And this is what's currently available in print right now. My copy is a vintage copy, which came with an extended guidebook. If you can find this, it is 1000% worth it. It is so good. I've been using this as a reference for my Drop 'em 78, just to have a non-esoteric historical resource to fall back upon. So some excellent chapters on history. 3 full introductory chapters before we even get into chapter 4, which is the assigning meaning to the trumps or triumphs. And he talks about different possibilities for that and why he went the direction that he did. So in his little white book with the Universal Tarot of Marseille, all you're getting is this little section here. In the extended guidebook, you're getting all of this background information, and it's so, so helpful. But even better, once you get to chapter 5 on the quartz and pips, you get a whole lot more information than what's available in the little white book. So he starts with a level 1 reading, which is blending the meaning of the pip numbers with the meaning of the suits. Level 2 goes into more of a storytelling methodology combined with that blending that you learned in level 1. And he doesn't want to give you the answers, so he makes up a suit of egg beaters and then goes through the storytelling of preparing a meal and eating a meal, just to give you some hints on how to come up with your own associations. And a lot of reading pips really is coming up with your own system. So don't stress out too much about finding the right one, because we all develop our own systems. I think that's probably true of reading illustrated pips as well. Then level 3 is fully into the visual interpretation of the plants and the shapes and all of that kind of thing. Really good stuff. And then a little more advice on reading. And then a sample reading at the end. So like I said, if you can get this, it's gettable. It's just out of print, which I think is a travesty. Lee Burston does not have an individually published book. But if you can get this, it's great. If you can't, it's still worth it. I would consider this an excellent beginner TDM deck. As you can see, it's quite beautiful. So it might not be as jarring to people who don't like the traditional historical decks. And then we've got some color coordination here for the pips. Each suit being a different color. And it still sticks to, even though it's a Swiss pattern, for the most part it sticks to the traditional TDM. So you'll still be able to read other TDM decks if you learn from this one. And one example, if you're worried, this full Swiss pattern has a different hanged one, but this has the traditional TDM hanged one, so no need to worry about that. Now, what if you really want a longer book by Lee Burston, but you can't find this out-of-print version? Well, never fear, because we've got the Tarot Decoratif by Ciro Marchetti. And this is an especially good one for folks coming from the RWS tradition, because the pips, while they don't follow the TDM shapes, as you can see here with the batons, they do include vignettes that are based on the illustrated RWS cards. Like Ciro Marchetti's art and other decks, it's gorgeous art. It's not my taste personally. I don't read with this deck. But even for folks who aren't going to use the deck, it comes with an extended guidebook by Lee Burston, and this is all in English, the entire thing. Excellent book. And I even enjoy the introduction by Ciro Marchetti. It talks about his reasoning for the way he made the deck. It goes a little bit into the idea that Cathars created the TDM as an intentional tool for learning esoteric knowledge. If you know me, you know I don't ascribe to those kinds of ideas, but he's pretty agnostic about that idea. He just mentions hearing a talk about it, which really inspired him to try making a TDM deck, which I think is pretty cool. Lee Burston has an intro on tarot history and symbolism. Part 1 is the triumphs and the royal court. So very similar to his Lo Scarabeo book, he sticks with pre-esoteric historical ideas. And then he discusses the courts by rank, not by suit, but he gives ideas divided up into suits, which is very helpful. And then part 2 is all about the pips. And it's less about giving meanings for individual cards and more about an explanation on how to learn the pips. Now, he does interpret swords as thoughts and mental activity communication. Other schools of thought consider swords to be more to do with conflict, and that might actually be a more authentic way to read the swords, but we'll see later that you can actually blend the two as well. But again, all of this is about learning pips, tips on combining number and suit. So it's all really a how-to. And here's a chart which helps you to do that blending. And he's got some ideas for how to practice without necessarily memorizing. He does offer meanings for individual cards as well, if you're more comfortable with that, or want that in addition to blending your own meanings. And I think he ends with a spread. Yes, the Power of 10 spread is the last chapter. Super duper helpful book. It's not going to be as helpful for reading the shapes and the botanical features of a traditional TDM, but the information in here can really be translated to any pip deck. Highly recommend. And it's still in print. Anamaria Maruchi, on the other hand, is a little more open to English tradition and esoteric ideas seeping into her definitions, and that's completely valid. Here you can see this is based on the Convert. I think the vintage version is out of print, but you can get the standard version still, and there's a large professional deck as well. But if you're not super picky about avoiding esotericism, which she has a whole section in here, which she addresses, this is an excellent book. And like I said, I spent years learning from her full-sized book. And when I say esotericism, I'm not talking like full Kabbalah or astrology or anything like that. But for example, the Magician, it represents the beginning potential that beckons creativity and can generate everything by itself, directing will toward the highest goals. A man tinkering with his tools is an expression of the ability to make one's way in life, of self-serving cunning and talent. And yet it doesn't take much to transition from a cunning creator to a mocking charlatan. What will you do? So you can see how she really blends the esoteric potential type interpretation with the more historical trickster type interpretation. And I think that's great. But this is extremely useful. The first 40 pages are in English. And she includes information on Pythagoras and Pythagorean numerology, which is a concept that the Renaissance creators of tarot would have been familiar with, even if they weren't necessarily using it to interpret the cards. And maybe they were, who knows? Like Burston, she sticks to more modern interpretations of the suits, including communication and intellect for the swords. But then importantly, she organizes the pips and quarts by rank and number and not by suit, which I think is, again, so important for learning pips. She also talks about reading the botanical elements of the TDM, which is great. And then you can see the numbers are grouped together. So she gives a meaning of the number itself and then keywords based on the suit. Super duper helpful. And after that, she gives some information on reading, meditating with the tarot, a bunch of interesting ideas here. Super duper helpful. And if you don't mind a little bit of blending with more esoteric ideas that don't go so far as to include deep esotericism, but just more modern card interpretations, then this is a great choice. Tarot de Maria Celia, or de Maria Celia, by Leonard Jim Narciso, is such a good deck. It's one of my very first tarots. I love it so much. It's beautiful. So if you can get a hold of it, it's a great choice for folks who don't really enjoy the historical colors and figures as much. Gorgeous art. But it also has a super helpful little white book, which does group the pips by number rather than by suit. And I had to mention it because this was very influential in helping me to learn the TDM. The meanings for each number and for each suit underneath that number are quite a bit longer than what you find in Anamaria Maruchi's or Lee Burston's little white books. So if you can get a copy of this, it's quite valuable. And this whole book is in English. It's got some tips on reading toward the back. And he incorporates some more modern meanings, but really stays historically true as well. For example, the juggler is cunning, a variety of skills, resourcefulness, street smarts, dynamism, and wit, the commencement of an endeavor, original thoughts and ideas, strength of will, active engagement, confidence, one who can lead and make actual changes, charisma, making the most of opportunities, a hands-on approach to undertakings. So I would say that's pretty historically accurate. This is by US Games. I think it's a travesty that it's out of print. I wish US Games would bring this back. Now you may have heard that the Squid Kick Marseille is a great way to learn the TDM. And I love this deck, but I wouldn't recommend it as a first TDM because the imagery is just too off. The pips are great. The colors are quite different. And, you know, colors are pretty important to reading TDM. But these images aren't archetypal enough, in my opinion, for learning. Now, it's a great deck to use after you're already familiar with the TDM pattern, but it's a little weird for a first deck. It's a super great and usable deck, though, and I do recommend it. The reason a lot of people recommend it is because of the guidebook, and it does have a really good guidebook. However, I would say that it's super similar to Yoav Bendov's Little White Book in his CBD Tarot, and this is a much better place to start as a learning deck. So if you want to get the Squid Cake Marseille because you really like the art and you're already familiar with TDM, I would say go for it. It does have a really great guidebook. But if you're getting it to learn TDM and just want it for the guidebook, I would go with Yoav Bendov's CBD Tarot, because his Little White Book included is, I would say, certainly what the Squid Cake guidebook is based on. Bendov does not use Pythagorean or any other association with numbers. He definitely incorporates more modern, post-esoteric meanings for his triumphs. And he gives individual meanings for the pips and courts, including reversals. So it might be a much more familiar approach for folks who come from reading RWS. But his interpretations of the cards are based both on the visuals of the card itself as well as cartomantic tradition. So if you're less interested in blending numbers with suits to creatively come up with a meaning, then Yoav Bendov's approach might be much more approachable for you. And on top of that, this is a faithful restoration of the Convert TDM, which is an excellent place to start with learning the TDM. It's clear, easy to read. I've got it more or less in order right now because I'm using it for my Drop 'em 78 challenge. So excellent as a first deck. And then if you really like the Little White Book, you can always purchase his extended book. The in-print version is Tarot de Marseille Revealed, and his self-published version is Open Reading. He is no longer with us, but his website is still active, and I think you can get the ebook of Open Reading on his website, or you can purchase his in-print version. The two books are essentially the same. And if you prefer his approach, I highly recommend. Now, what if you're not into the swords referencing simply intellect and want to get even more authentic historically? Then you might go with the Hedge Witch approach. I haven't read any Camellia Elias yet. I have one of her books that's on my TBR pile, but I've heard that the Pip-Speak Tarot sums up her reading style quite well. And honestly, there's nothing in this guidebook that contradicts any of what I've already shown you. So all of these different methods can certainly be combined. They're just different approaches. But Kitten Chops really sticks to historical interpretations. For example, Le Pendu. Is he hanging upside down to get a new perspective? Nope. Likely he is getting punished by being hung upside down, as it was custom in medieval times. In any case, he is taking a leave of the everyday world. He has stopped, checked out, logged out, and resigned. That's great. So it's very concise. She does blend numbers with suit associations. The numbers in the Hedge Witch system are a little different from the Pythagorean numbers, but not so much so that they contradict each other too severely. My understanding is Camellia Elias does not emphasize elements, except for when she uses tarot with magic. And the Pip-speak Little White Book does not emphasize elements either. Personally, I consider elements to be an esoteric layer, and I don't use them unless they're right in front of me on the card. And if you don't relate to layering on elements, it's not necessary. So I just want to reassure you of that. If you like elements, then definitely use them. But her elements that she does suggest for doing ceremonial magic are different from the Golden Dawn elements, which are the most common associations. But if you get into learning about TDM, you will see that everybody has different elemental associations. A lot of people are not following the Golden Dawn because we're coming from more continental perspectives. But in addition to giving some meanings to the numbers, she also talks about reading them qualitatively. So bigger and smaller numbers, meaning, you know, moving fast or slow, or expanding and shrinking, for example. She relates them to temperatures. Just some really useful ways to think about the cards. And the court associations are traditional Hedge witch associations, which do include swords more as a conflict, although she does add in the idea of thoughts by adding the pansies as a symbol to her swords. So yeah, this is a great Little White Book, and it's an excellent deck. Even though this isn't a conventional TDM, I wouldn't hesitate to recommend this as a first TDM deck if you just really don't like the historical decks, because she keeps a lot of the color and position and botanical associations, and that's what makes it a good TDM learning deck, in my opinion, where the squid cake falls short. It's a gorgeous deck, lovely to work with. And it includes some fun extra cards as well. There's a lot of great books out there on the Hedge witch methods, which tend to be more associated with playing cards. They're not so different from tarot associations that they have to be seen as two different systems, in my opinion. They can definitely inform each other. But if you really like the idea of reading tarot like traditional playing cards, the Playing Marseille is also a great option. And this sticks to very similar associations you'll find if you're familiar with Camellia Elias or already have the Pip-speak, and talks about the Hedge witch method using French suits rather than Italian tarot suits. So these cards really are a delight. This is another great option if you're not so into the historical art. I adore this art. And it's a nice way to blend learning tarot pips along with playing card pips, which is a weird distinction. Tarot is also playing card, but you know what I mean, French suited pips with a super handy guidebook. So these are really historically traditional and stick to the Hedge witch or Camellia Elias tradition. Now, a couple of honorable mentions that I wouldn't necessarily recommend for beginners, but which are also kind of maybe a second step into deepening your TDM practice. Tarot de Marseille by Pablo Robledo is a gorgeous deck. This cardstock is absolutely delicious, super bendy and lovely, but thick and sturdy at the same time. It's got a rose petal finish, so there's a little bit of grip to it, but it's not super sticky. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because this guidebook is less about the logistics of reading and more just an absolutely poetic commentary on reading. I think probably influenced by Jodorowsky and or Yoav Ben-Dov, who both come from a similar school of thought. And if you're interested in just kind of deepening your philosophy of reading the cards, this is excellent. And it also has a QR code for an extended version online. It's half in English and half in Spanish. Now you'll want to do a little bit of research. There are several editions of this deck. And my understanding is that not all of them come with the book. I don't know the details of that. I got this secondhand, so that's just a little heads up. You'll want to research that if you're interested in it for the book. You want to make sure the version that you order has it. Now, what if you're a little bit icked out by some of the Eurocentric, colonial, patriarchal ideas embodied in the symbolism of the tarot, and you want to deconstruct that a little bit? Super duper recommend The Gay Marseille by Charlie Claire Burgess, and the separate guidebook you can order from their website. I think they are the Word Witch on Instagram. I'll put that in the description so you can find them. And this is Not only super useful as a book, but this is a super fun deck. I used it a lot over the summer, especially because the aqua and flamingo colors are just great. They're super fun, but it also is historically respectful to the imagery. One very minor complaint I might have is that there is sometimes a little bit too much imagery in the pips, in my opinion. A lot of it is neutral, such as that. Like, that definitely is saying something about strength, but it's not too overbearing. But there are a few images, such as this one and this one, which reflect an option for traditional reading of the pips, but it may not be the option that the reader follows. And one of the benefits, in my opinion, of pips is that they are neutral, and you don't have to, you can kind of choose the association that appeals to you or speaks to you most strongly. It's a very minor complaint though. The decorations on the pips are mostly quite neutral and can be ignored if they aren't. But this deck is all about subversion. It really challenges a lot of the beliefs inherent to the tarot, and I think that's historically appropriate because tarot itself was kind of revolutionary and populist in its way. Very subversive and satirical. I mean, that is traditional to the historical tarot as well. Now, in my opinion, I don't think you have to be a member of the LGBTQIA community to use or benefit from this deck. It's not just about sexuality. It is mostly about breaking down assumptions and challenging the system, which is amazing. The meanings are absolutely on point as far as a historical perspective. For example, we start with the juggler, even discussing the cup and ball trick and everything, but then moving on to more contemporary associations that make the TDM so relevant to our world today. I absolutely love it and could not recommend it more. You could certainly use this as your first TDM deck if you'd like to skip tradition altogether. I'm not sure that I would recommend it as your first, but as a second TDM deck to deepen your practice and to expand the possibilities for you with the TDM, super duper recommend it. And the deck itself is great. It's a nice linen shuffleable cardstock, but they are sold separately. So if you're not interested in the deck and just want a more subversive take on the Tarot de Marseille, you could if you want to just get the guidebook. And the deck itself also comes with a little reference card, which is handy. Finally, let's get to my book recommendation. Now, again, I didn't want this to be a video about books, and maybe someday I will do a video about books. That's a big project, which I would definitely overthink. So we'll see if I ever get around to that. Maybe I will slip in book recommendations on a more casual basis instead of trying to do one big opus on books. But after a lot of thought and consideration, I have come to determine that Caitlin Matthews' Untold Tarot, in my opinion, is probably the most useful book for learning not just the TDM, but how to read historical decks. And the reason for that is because it's both concise and inclusive. So she really includes a bunch of different possibilities for how to read the cards. So you can see I have the numbers section marked off. She does go into detail about Pythagorean associations, but she brings in other possibilities as well. So for folks who might get a little stressed out by all the various number associations that are out there, and I was that person at the beginning too, this is such a great overview that combines several of the different number associations. It also includes a bunch of charts. I kind of remember this chart not necessarily vibing for me, but again, there are so many different options in here that you can choose what works for you. Here's a section on combining the number and suit keywords. She uses multiple different types of historical decks, which is awesome. And then we continue to even more depth on number associations, here incorporating the association with the triumphs in the division by tens method, which is more traditional for Tarot de Marseille. So just an amazing overview of a whole bunch of different ways of seeing numbers and suits, which is so beyond helpful. Then in the section on working with the pips, it talks about how to actually go about using all that information to read. And for example, this chart on suit interactions gives some keywords for what a certain combination of suits might mean. So swords upon swords might mean struggle and trouble, whereas swords combined with batons might mean ambition and speed. Super duper cool. There's a section on some spreads, and the imagery is amazing. It talks about directionality in the courts, which is very traditional. Super helpful to know. There's a whole section on the cardinal virtues and associations based around the cardinal virtues. So dang cool. And then finally, once you have studied all of these different associations, we get into the meat of the book, which is the divining skills. And this will blow your mind wide open, I swear. As far as the most bang for your buck, with a ton of really well organized information, leading into some very practical tips and approaches, at the risk of being disloyal to many of the other authors whom I adore, I am going to recommend this as my #1 choice. And it's also not a super long read. It's, that's a book that's written in a really straightforward way that you can tackle without a huge time commitment. So if you've got a historical deck that you enjoy and you want to go beyond the little white book or the guidebook that goes with it and really get into the practical art of reading historical decks, Untold Tarot by Caitlin Matthews, 100%. One of the small complaints that I've seen about it is that some of her ideas about historical associations that would have been made at the time the tarot was made are not very well cited. So if you're really into the history, some things in here might irk you a little bit. They didn't irk me though, so I guess I'm just not enough of a super dork to have been irked by it. It has been a little while since I've read it though, so maybe if I reread it with what I know now, some things might rub me the wrong way, who knows. But also, really detailed and well-organized triumph associations too. And Caitlin Matthews certainly knows her stuff when it comes to tarot and tarot history, so I consider her a trusted source for sure. So those are my recommendations for folks exploring the TDM or wanting to continue their TDM studies if they've already started. Let me know if you have your own recommendations or otherwise what you think. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.